Good day, everyone. I am Antoinette Magtoto from Social Studies to be your discussant for today. My topic is about global problems. There are so many problems that the world is facing. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Global problems are continuing, a never-ending process. Sometimes may solve, but something will rise again. It will be a never-ending process that the world needs to face every single day of world's life. This topic shall concern with the problem that the world's already encountered and will be encountered. The crime, war, and terrorism. Before I proceed to the discussion, I want to hear your idea. The first thing comes up with your mind if you hear the word crime. Now that some of you may know what crime is, let us proceed with our discussion. Crime is an action or omission that constitute an offense that may be prosecuted by the state and punishable by law. What is a crime in one society is not necessarily a crime in another. Just as it's difficult to decide what constitutes abuse, it is difficult to define crime. In one society, it may be a crime to walk over someone's land without permission. In another, there might be any of personal ownership and therefore not concept of trespassing. In seeking to understand variation to crime, many researchers have not surprisingly preferred to compare those behaviors that are more or less universally considered crimes and that are reliably reported. The United States has a higher common rates than nearly every other European country. Homicide rates tend to rise after a war, whenever a country is lost or triumphant. This result supports the premises that during times of conflict, a culture or nation legitimizes violence. That is, society approves of murdering the enemy during wartime. Nevertheless, once the conflict is over, inhibition against killing may be loosened, resulting in an increase of homicide rates. In the types of societies anthropologists have typically studied, homicide statistics are not often available. However, where statistics are available, the variation appears to be much greater than among modern nations. Some of the highest homicide rates described is more than 10 times the rate of any known country today. Cross-cultural studies of homicide usually measure homicide rates by comparing and ordering ethnographers' statements about the frequency of homicides. Despite the fact that the data on cultural homicide rates are not quantitative, the cross-cultural results are consistent with the cross-national results. More war is usually associated with more homicide and assaults, as well as the society-approved aggressive behavior and severe physical punishment of wrongdoing. Capital punishment, execution of criminals, is severe physical punishment for wrongdoing. It is commonly thought that the prospect of capital punishment deters would-be murderers. Yet, cross-national research suggests otherwise. More countries show murder rates going down rather than up after capital punishment. After capital punishment was abolished, capital punishment may legitimize violence rather than deter it. According to United States, juvenile delinquents are more likely to originate from broken household, where the father is away for the most of the boy's childhood. The common conclusion that the absence of the father increases the risk of delinquency and adult physical violence. Societies in which children are reared in mother-child household, where fathers sleep at a distance, or the father spend little time caring for the child, tend to have more physical violence than do societies in which fathers spend time with children. The rate of violence crime is also more frequent in nations that have more women than men, which is consistent with the theory that father absence increases violence. I know. It is possible, as some argue, that boys without father are more likely to act super masculine in order to demonstrate how man they are. However, it's probable the mothers who raise their children alone experience greater irritation and anger, and hence are more likely to set an aggressive example for their children. Furthermore, polygyny is predicted by high male mortality in war and an excess of women. Hence, males are polygynous communities are more likely to be exposed to a warrior heritage. One widely held idea is that poor economic condition increase the likelihood of crime. But the relationship does not appear to be strong. Also, the findings are somewhat different from different types of crime. For example, hundreds of studies in this and other countries do not show a clear relationship between changes of economic well-being as measured by unemployment rate and changes in violent crime, as measured by a homicide. The rate of homicide does not appear to increase in bad times. Property crimes, however, do increases in unemployment. Property crime is associated to cross-cultural observation that stealing occurs less frequently in egalitarian communities than in stratified cultures. Property crime is associated to unemployment, which is consistent with the cross-cultural observation that stealing occurs less frequently in egalitarian communities than in stratified culture. In societies where everyone has equal access to resources, there are normally distribution mechanisms in place to compensate for wealth disparities. As the result, stealing should lessen appealing. As a result, in an equitable society, it is less likely. Such socialization is linked to war and other forms of society approves violence, capital punishment, television, and movie violence by heroes, violence in sport. The reduction of inequalities in wealth may also help to reduce crime, particularly theft, and although it is not yet clear why it appears that raising boys with the male role model around may reduce a likelihood to male violence adulthood. Second, we will discuss that one of the main problems of the world that when this problem occurs, there is possibility of millions death and country destroyed, the war. When you hear the word war, what is the first thing that you think of? There are two important points to note about war. First, war is an unfortunate fact of life in most societies known to anthropology. Second, it is now fairly clear that warfare has declined over the long stretch of history. The United States has not had a war on its territory since the Civil War, which is uncommon that disregard most ethnographic societies had regular armed fighting among groups of or bigger entities that shared the same language before pacification. That is, the majority of conflict took place within the community or language group. Although people from different culture may fight against people from other societies, such internal wars or rarely organized on behalf of the entire society or even a significant portion of it. That is, ethnographic warfare did not typically involve political unified societies. Although the total number of persons slain was minimal, this does not indicate that fighting in non-industrial society was insignificant. when unanticipated climate-related calamities devastate food sources in non-industrial culture, violence appears to be more likely. Because chronic food shortage do not forecast violence, it appears that people are motivated to fight mostly by a fear of future loss. If that's the case, we can expect them to grab resources if they win. They do, in fact, even when the victorious side has no current resource concerns, the victorious side almost always take resources from the defeated. Armed conflict appears to be more prevalent with periods of deteriorating climate and increased disasters. Teaching children to distrust others is another aspect that appears to be contributing to increased war. People who are distrustful of others as children may grow up to be distrustful or others as adults. Threats of fear or fears of disaster appears to be a factor of people's willingness to go to war rather than negotiate or seek peace with enemy. In state cultures, the relationship between natural disaster and conflict appears to be the polar opposite. States appear less likely to fight when there are food-related disasters, possibly because they have standing armies that need to be supplied. In the modern world, with its complex economic and political interdependencies among nations, possibly resource shortage such as oil may be more important factors. However, interstate battles are becoming increasingly rare, with internal conflicts and civil wars accounting for the majority of today's armed conflicts. While disaster may not be clearly linked to conflict, in state societies, civil war are anticipated by countries' per capita income. All of today's war are fought in poorer countries. In contrast, prosperity appears to make conflict unappealing with wealthy countries. Disasters and poverty both suggest that people's livelihood are in jeopardy. War is one method of obtaining resources, but it comes at a high price. However, we may not be realizing that conflict is not the only method to assure resource availability. In the current world, there may be a better way, one that is both more cost-effective and more protective of human life. The international community, including governments and non-government organizations, has already demonstrated its willingness to intervene in calamities. The assurance of disaster help around the world may lessen people's dread of disaster, but far more essential than responding to catastrophes that may already occur. Eliminating poverty reduces people's vulnerability to disaster in the first place. Recent political science and anthropological research reveals another strategy to lower the probability of war. Studies show that people in more participatory, that is, more democratic, political system rarely go to war with each other among the societies studied by anthropology. As a result, if authoritarian governments were to vanish from the world as a result of powerful nations ceasing to support them military and otherwise, the world will be a more peaceful place. Although democratically controlled states rarely go to war with one another, it was once assumed that they are not inherently more peaceful in general, that they are just likely to go to war as other types of political system, but not with the one another. According to the most recent cross-national evidence, expanding democracy of war Expanding democracy around the world will reduce the probability of war in the long run. Change in political system, on the other hand, is neither straightforward nor simple. In fact, civilization undergoing democratic transition are more vulnerable to ethnic conflict and civil war. The lowest likelihood of war is found between stable or mature democracies. According to recent studies by political scientists, encouraging states to be more economically intertwined and supporting the expansion of international non-profit groups to provide informal mechanism to address problems would reduce the likelihood of war. And we have studied about the crime and war. And we know that the word next to crime and war is the word territory. We have heard territories in our life, how people fight for their land, and now we have to come to study the terrorism. Some of you may know what terrorism is, and now let's proceed on discussing the terrorism. Ever since September 11, 2001, when terrorists crashed airlines into the World Trade Center towers in New York City and into Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, people all over the world realized that terrorism has become a social problem globally. It is now painfully clear that organized group of terrorists can train their people to kill themselves and thousands of other half a world away. Not only by hijacking airlines and flying those into skyscrapers, but also by using easily transported explosives and biological weapons. Social scientists are now actively trying to understand terrorism in the hope that researchers may lead the way to minimize the likelihood of future attacks. It's not easy to answer these questions. Most people can recall incidents that almost no one would hesitate to label as terrorism. It's more difficult to draw a line between terrorism, crime, political persecution, and conflict. Terrorism, according to most scholars, entails the threat or use of violence against civilians. In contrast, the most crime, which are usually committed by individuals acting alone, terrorism is frequently politically or socially organized. One distinguished feature of most crime for terrorism is that criminals rarely claim public credit for their action in order to avoid getting captured. In most cases of terrorism, the culprits declare their guilt. In terrorism also, the violence is directed mostly to unarmed people, including women and children. It is intended to frighten the enemy, to terrorize them, to scare them into doing something that the terrorists want to see happen. Generally, then, terrorism may be defined as the use or threat of violence to create terror in others, usually for political purposes. Some define terrorism as perpetrated by groups that are not formal political entities. We still don't have a lot of systematic studies that explain why terrorism happens and why people become terrorists. However, there are a lot of research on state terrorism. According to J. Rummel, governments killed almost 262 million people in the 20th century. He referred to this type of terrorism as democide. State terrorism has resulted in 4 times the number of deaths as all civil and international wars combined in the 20th century. Democratic governments are less prone to engage in state terrorism, but when they do, it is usually in response to a rebellion or a war. If totalitarian regimes are more likely to engage in state terrorism than terrorism, and terrorist groups may be common in such societies. If this is the case, the development of democracy, just as it's appeared to reduce the possibility of war between countries, may be our best hope for, for reducing the risk of terrorism around the world. We know relatively little so far about what predicts who will become a terrorist. We do know that terrorists often comes from higher social status and generally have more education than the average person. But while terrorists are not commonly poor, it is important to ask whether the societies in which terrorism thrives are deprived in some way. They do tend to occur in countries that are lower in measures of human development that have poor record. And that concludes our discussion for today. And that leads me to my question to you. If you understand what we just discussed, you can answer this question. What is the reason why male would most likely to commit crime? That is right. Men would use resort to physical violence because they don't have something like a father figure to look up to. To fully understand the topic about the global problems, the students are asked to play the game's word association. I will provide the subject matter, and the student will think of the word that associate with the given subject matter. It is a maximum of 20 words and minimum of 5 words. The subject matters are the crime, war, and terrorism. Now that you understand the topic, we will make a word cloud. Every student is required to give a word about global problems. One student is assigned to make a word cloud. So students are assigning to explain the bigger word in your word cloud. And now, your word cloud has a bigger word that is a crime. The question is, why the word crime is the biggest word in your work?